Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. Today it's lesson 2, but part 2 of 2, the birth of Jesus Christ. In the previous lesson, we took time in the video to read Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 12, Luke chapter 2, 6 through 17, and John 1, 14. If you weren't with us for that study, I would suggest that you go back and watch that video first. It's in the playlist on the YouTube channel, or you could pause this video right now and read those passages and then join me again once you've read those passages. Now we'll take a quick look at our outline so you can see where we are so far. We have talked about the fall of man, and now this is the second part of lesson 2 concerning his birth. We're looking ahead to a lesson on his baptism, his temptation, another one, his transfiguration, his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, and then finally a lesson concerning man's redemption. In our previous video on the birth of Christ, we talked about the mystery of the God-man. And now in this video, we'll finish up our discussion of the birth of Christ by talking about the fact of God being in Christ and that there were signs that were given to the world concerning the fact that this God-man was coming to earth. God was in Christ. He is the purpose, and we want to talk about this purpose of the incarnation. And the simple answer can be found in 2 Corinthians 5:19, where Paul says, that is, in Christ God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Of course, then, the complete reconciliation of man is dependent upon the death of Christ. In Colossians 1, 21 and 22, Paul says, and you who once were alienated and hostile in mind and doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. However, without the incarnation, there would have been no death on the cross. In our first study, we learned that man through the ages has distanced himself from God by sinning. Man's perception of God had become perverted, and thus the need for God incarnate. The incarnation corrected false ideas. Man had made God over in man's own image. With that image comes man's shortcomings, and thus a God with faults. Instead of a man-like God, we must realize that God is spiritual, not temporal. What man's physical body is to his spirit, all the created universe is to God. When man fell, as we discussed in lesson 1, he necessarily became materially minded, and so did his gods. We, in our previous study, talked about Baal, Moloch, and Mammon, and now we can add the gods of Greece and Rome to this mix. These gods were as men. They were lazy gods, trivial gods, vindictive gods, and selfish gods. The answer to discovering God could not come from man, but only from God, through God incarnate, namely Jesus Christ. The incarnation fulfilled all previous right thinking among spiritual men and presented them, and us today, with a new understanding for the future. Jesus was the perfect man for this job. 1, he was able to reveal himself as God, and 2, he was able to reveal how humanity should operate. God showed centuries of patience in preparing mankind for the coming of Christ. Well, that automatically makes us think, Why was Christ not sent sooner? Man was given over to idolatry, so the Israelites had to be sent first to prepare man to return to worshiping one true God. And even the Israelites had a hard time learning this lesson. As early in the Bible as Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4, they had to be told this, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The instrument God could use for his revelation had to come through Israel. Theirs was the only nation on earth that could provide the proper conduit for the incarnation. Through Christ comes perfect humanity. In him, the spiritual is harmonized with the material. Christ demonstrates the spirit as dominant over the body, and the physical body is governed and glorified if we are to be spiritual men. And finally, the spiritual body is enthroned. It is only through the God-man that deity takes hold upon humanity and humanity takes hold upon deity. Christ is the only gateway between God and man. And the words of Christ prove it. They are the words of God. His teaching was the sum of all wisdom. In Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This is not the speech of a man. No man ever spoke like this man. This was the speech of God. So his words prove it. His teaching shows that he contained the sum of all wisdom, and his deeds also proved that he was God incarnate. Could a mortal man have cleansed the temple? Jesus blessed the children in Matthew 19:14. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." Yet in the Jewish scheme of things, children were worth nothing, and they weren't even counted in the census. We are to be of the same mind as Christ. Paul told the Philippians in chapter 2, verse 5, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, a mind that is set in action by love." The ultimate value of the incarnation is that it broke down the human misconceptions of God that had caused man to hate God. In doing so, man could once again love God through Christ. It is only after being reconciled to God through his death that we can be saved by his life. Paul told the Roman readers in chapter 5 and verse 10, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of the Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life." So we've talked about the mystery of the God-man. We've talked about God was in Christ, and we'll finish our study of the birth of Christ by looking at signs given to the world. First, we'll talk about signs to the sons of men. When he appeared to his own, we know that he was rejected. In John 1 and verse 11, it says he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Well, why? They either rejected or misunderstood their own prophets. They made no connection with the prophecy of Isaiah 53. And if you're not familiar with that chapter, you might want to pause here and go read it. And also Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel." The people largely had lost their spiritual sense, and therefore they were looking for not a spiritual leader, but an earthly prince. And they had no real conception of the Messiah as the servant of God. Meanwhile, what about the Gentiles? The Romans were obviously not waiting for the newborn king of the Jews, and the Greeks were not expecting the next great teacher to come from among the Hebrews. The time was right because man had sunk to the depths of sin and worldliness. There were two kinds of signs given, direct and indirect. The direct signs given include Matthew 2, verses 1 and 2, the star. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. In Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. So this star had been predicted as far back as Numbers chapter 24. We also have looked at the angelic ministry to Mary, Joseph, the shepherds, and the wise men. But before that, in Luke 1 and verse 11, an angel came to talk to Elizabeth's husband Zacharias concerning John the Baptist. It says that there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. So the angelic ministry had been part of the direct signs given to man. We'll add to this the voice of the prophets, both old and new. Matthew shows the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. But new prophets are now being heard. Zacharias, Mary, Elizabeth. We also read in the New Testament about Anna and Simeon. And of course, as we've already noted, Zacharias was the father of John the Baptist. There are also indirect signs given. First of all, the testimony of the Magi to Herod. They were looking for the King of the Jews. Then, after the shepherds heard the angels, went and verified what the angels said, they went about giving their own testimony. And the fact that Herod was willing to slaughter all the young males in the area of Bethlehem of the age 2 years and younger stands as an indirect sign. The so-called slaughter of the innocents, and I think that's a good name for it. Of course, many at the time did not recognize these signs, and even today we perhaps only understand them in part. However, upon further study, we can come to realize their deepest significance. We'll sum up our lesson on the birth of Christ and leave you with two final thoughts. Jesus Christ came to earth so that man might be reunited with God. In doing so, Christ fulfilled the reason that God created man and satisfied God's ultimate purpose, which is love. Finally, Christ came to earth in the unique incarnation of the God-man, and the first of the 7 crises that he must experience to bring reconciliation to mankind. So these are our thoughts on the birth of Christ. We hope that these 2 parts of this lesson have been helpful, and we hope that you will continue to study with us as we move through the other 6 turning points in the life of Christ as we study in the weeks to come. Please subscribe to our channel, ring the notification bell, give us a like, a thumbs up, we would appreciate that, and also a comment and any suggestions you might have. Until we meet again next time, may God bless.